Hi, my name's Hamish Phelan. So today I'll be asking the more specific question of, did the British government and the BBC hide the horror of nuclear war from the public? So I'll start with a sort of introduction to the BBC and the unique position they fill in the British media. I'll then introduce the director of the film that I'll be talking about specifically, which is The War Game. I'll then move on to my sort of detailed analysis of declassified archive documents that show how the war game was banned. And then the hardest job for a historian, I'm going to try and convince you why this is relevant for today. So the BBC is an independent public service broadcaster. It's really unlike any other media organisation in the world. It is sworn independence from government. It's also funded by a licence fee, which is a sort of tax paid by members of the public who have a television. This means that it's able to be free from advertising and therefore any sort of corporate interests. And until the 1950s, the BBC was the only channel available in the UK. But in 1955, ITV was founded, which, unlike the BBC, was funded by advertising. This sort of created a new competition for the BBC, which was part of the reason why, and also due to a sort of cultural revolution happening in the 60s as well. This 1960s are seen as a time when the BBC really opened up to new ideas, became more critical of the government, and started sort of broadcasting what people wanted to watch rather than what they thought they should watch. This is also largely down to, well, usually accredited to its leader in the 1960s, Sir Hugh Green. So this is Peter Watkins. And so part of the reformation of the BBC in the 1960s was hiring new and young talent. And one of those people was Peter Watkins, who was talent scouted for the BBC in 1963. Almost immediately he expressed an interest in making a film about nuclear war. He was heavily influenced by images from the atomic bombing of Japan in 1945, and believed that there had been a sort of media silence in the West about the atrocities that had occurred. So this is his proposal for the film on the effects of a nuclear bombing, submitted in 1963, where he says the average mind of today refuses to think of, let alone accept, the most soul-shuddering decline of basic humane thinking probably in the history of mankind that is in us all now. So he's clearly very passionate about telling the public the truth about nuclear war. The BBC tried to sort of put him off with other projects for a few years, but eventually it became clear that he would resign unless they let him make it, so reluctantly they let him go ahead. I first saw the film in a nuclear bunker in St Andrews a few years ago, and I'd really recommend anyone finding it. It's online nowadays, but it's really, really striking. Artistically, it was really innovative. It actually won an Oscar for the best documentary feature, despite it being banned. And it's a sort of documentary set in the future, or near future. So it's filmed using non-professional actors and handheld camera techniques to create a really realistic feel to a sort of post-nuclear attack Britain. And it depicts, within 50 minutes or so, the brutal social, psychological and physical effects of a nuclear attack and the complete failure of the government to deal with them. So when the film was finished, the BBC management viewed it, and strangely, almost immediately, their reaction was to write to the government with this letter saying that the showing of the film on television might have a significant effect on public attitudes towards the nuclear deterrent, and that the film should be seen by senior officials from the government. It's kind of strange that an independent broadcaster should have such a concern about the public's attitudes towards a policy of nuclear deterrent. So immediately, when sort of researching this, it flags it's a bit of a red flag for why they would show this film to officials in the first place. The government officials accepted the invite and reported back to the ministers that the film might possibly make it more difficult to take decisions to reduce future expenditure in this field. So basically they had planned to make cuts in the near future to the already kind of like skeleton defenses they had in place in case of a nuclear attack. And they argued that it was so political that the government should take direct action and ban the film. But the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, refused this request and said that as a government they shouldn't get involved in the BBC, but then did brief his officials with a long list of his problems with the film. So it seems like he's respecting the BBC's independence here, so maybe story over, but there's a bit of a twist because in this barely legible document that was declassified in 2003 from a Freedom of Information Act, it details a lunch between the head of the BBC and a senior minister called Herbert Bowden, where it was agreed that if the conclusion were to be reached by the government that the film should not be shown, Sir Hugh Green, who was the leader of the BBC, said that he would be prepared to issue a press statement to the effect that the BBC itself had decided that it would be against public interest for the film to be shown. So almost agreeing that if the government didn't want the film to be screened, the BBC were prepared to lie and say that that decision was theirs. So then all Harold Wilson had to do, without getting directly involved, was send some officials over to the BBC to make it clear that they would be relieved if the BBC decides not to show it. And the message was clearly received from this note from a senior member of the BBC. And then a couple of weeks later, the BBC released a press statement saying that the film was too horrific for the medium of broadcast, despite the fact that in no meeting between the BBC management, the film's horror was ever raised as an issue that would mean it couldn't be screened. And they privately told the director that they believed 20,000 people would kill themselves if the film was screened. He saw right through this lie and actually resigned from the BBC immediately. They then released the story later on saying that on BBC News saying that he'd maltreated actors on set, which he phoned them up and said that unless they retracted that story the next day, he'd go around to the headquarters and take it down brick by brick. So they did retract it, and in outrage he left the country and has never worked here again. And the film wasn't screened for 20 years. So why would this supposedly independent organisation be so easy to manipulate for the government? Well, it's important to look into the BBC's situation in 1965. They faced huge debt from the recent expansion. They'd recently founded BBC Two. So to make up for that, they were begging Harold Wilson to increase the license fee, but he was refusing because of an upcoming election, and he was worried that the public wouldn't like having to pay more. So instead, he proposed, because of the recent success of ITV, he proposed instead of that they'd introduce advertising to the BBC, which would really harm its kind of core belief in independence from corporate demands. So also he had a bit of a personal issue with the BBC. He'd accused them of bias in Parliament and had established a ministerial committee to look into the BBC's future. At the head of that committee was actually Herbert Bowden, who appeared earlier in the story as being at that luncheon with the head of the BBC. So a bit of a coincidence. But why is this relevant? There's a lot of scientists in the room that probably think history is kind of pointless. But once again, the BBC is facing a remarkably similar situation to the one it did in 1965. So it's facing a huge economic crisis and having to make cuts to make up for that, while at the same time facing a pretty critical government that accuses them of bias and threatens them with attack or changing their funding structure, which basically maintains its core values. So it's a very similar situation to the one it faced in 1965. So the war game and the banning of the war game and these declassified files teach us that we need to be more vigilant about the BBC's independence from government and not just accept mainstream narratives about what it is. It also shows us that despite it being an independent organisation, the fact that the government has control over how it's funded shows that it can still have influence over the decisions and its output. And finally, that censorship can be hidden behind a complex relationship between the media and the government, and it's not always in your face, but sometimes more subtle and harder to find. So I just wanted to say thank you to the National Archives and thank you for listening.